Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to my workshop. Today I'm going to share all the juicy points that I've been able to collect in the 10 years now that I've been looking into these topics. And today's focus is going to be on the ancient culture, the Sumerian culture, which very interestingly enough has very strong biblical ties to the English and Old Hebrew Testament stories of man's interaction with their living gods. Okay, so where do we come from? I touched on this basically a little bit in my lecture, but the scientific viewpoints for where we come from always kind of have butted heads with either evolution or religious. And the scientific viewpoints are starting to push the notion that life more than likely arose on Earth from panspermia, that somehow life arrives whole and complete. There isn't enough time on the evolution of Earth's scale, 4.5 billion years, something like that, 4.7, for life to have just whimsically come together in primordial soup and a lightning bolt striking it, and all of a sudden there's life. So one of the theories they're starting to push is that possibly life actually arrived at Earth whole and complete. So this is pushed further with the research that we've done by looking at asteroids and comets, things where we've actually sent out things in space with an aerogel catcher and collect fragments of debris from these and found, wow, here's carbon, and many of the minerals and things that we need for life to get started are found floating around in space and arrive here in the form of comets and asteroids. So one of the things that we can really start to look for with our science is to start to confirm life beyond just Earth. And one of those environments that could be very hospitable to life is one of the moons of Jupiter called Europa. Now, the reason why this is really interesting is many of the other moons, Ganymede, Callisto, there's four major moons of Jupiter, but Ganymede and Callisto have extensive volcanic activity. And Europa, as you can see here, has extensive water. Now, the surface is covered by a a very thick ice sheet that you can see. It's cracked here, and it's kind of like, almost like plate tectonics here on Earth, where the ice is always kind of shifting, and so it gives us a view of how this planet is working. But interestingly enough, Europa has a 40-mile deep ocean below this ice. So they theorize if we're able to, and we are, there's a mission coming up in 2007 to do just this, if we do penetrate this ice sheet and go down to the surface of the ocean on Europa, there could be processes taking place just like they're here on Earth. When we go way down into the ocean, no sunlight whatsoever, there are these vents emanating hot minerals and sulfur and various other elements where life is thriving. So you wouldn't think it would be possible without sunlight or heat, but here at the bottom of the ocean, where there's thermal vents exist, there's life thriving. So we just apply that same science to, here we have another ocean on one of our moons of Europa. Maybe this is a possible good habitable place for life to evolve as well. So as we look at the more specifically how we came into the picture, there's this overriding theory of the missing link. That everything so simplistic is going to become more complex, but for whatever reason, science has not been able to connect us to the Neanderthal man. So there's been all these successions of the hominoid, but nothing that can actually put us in a connection with them. So that they say that there's a missing link. At some point we're going to find some species that actually connects us to the Australopithecine and all these various other Neanderthal men that evolution says we come from. So when we look at many of these structures all over the Earth, Stonehenge and Egypt and Giza, we start to realize that there was a brilliance being displayed by ancient man that we don't attribute to them. That using stone tools and living in clay huts, for the most part, they weren't able, as we would reckon, to be able to build such devices. But we still have all around the world evidence of them building and having a technology to build structures that we still can't even duplicate. And as an example here, we're looking at a quarry. There's a gentleman here. It's actually, his name is Ted. He's one of our people selling videos in the in the other room. But he went on a trip where this is a quarry, and this is Baalbek in Lebanon. You can see another gentleman standing here. by the rocks. And interestingly enough, these rocks, they're called trilithoton stones. They weigh like hundreds of tons. And this one was left at the quarry site, slightly broken, but it was 5 miles away from where they took these things into Baalbek and stacked them. So interestingly enough, they had the ability to cut out these rocks and quarry them out and move them 5 miles, where we still yet today don't really have technology that can cut a perfect rock out of the ground and move it, So it's very interesting that there are a lot of these types of artifacts around the world that show us that ancient man was somehow utilizing a type of technology that we still can't get our hands on how they were doing it. So one of the areas that's really sparked my interest in looking at all these structures, Giza, Nazca, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, Tiwanaku, I really started to want to know, well, who's the first culture? Where does all of this come from? And this led me to the culture that we have evidence of that came literally right out of the Stone Age, where modern-day Iraq is, known as Mesopotamia, Babylon. But the first culture to show up there were called Sumerians. And this is right between the Tigris and Euphrates. That strip of land there, it's kind of hard to see. It's called Mesopotamia. But then Mesopotamia, Babylon, that's today's Iraq. And this culture has left us artifacts in the form of stone tablets, pictograms, some of their monuments that still exist. But for the most part, their evidence exists in two forms. One of them is a clay tablet, and another one is called a cylinder seal. What the Sumerians devised was an ingenious way of being able to have kind of like an ancient printing press, where what they would do is they would reverse carve a picture into this round cylinder seal. Now scholars today still are baffled as to how they were able to carve in reverse such accurate pictures so that when you would roll it over wet clay, it leaves the positive imprint. So we have a lot of this information that was disseminated by the Sumerians on a daily basis about events, courts, laws, judges, schooling. So all of these things they recorded on stone tablets, and they also had a written language that was called cuneiform script. It consisted of over 400 characters, and it was basically like an oversized screwdriver that they would twist and turn it and make all these little characters called cuneiform script. Now, an alphabet with over 400 characters is pretty complex, and it's very interesting that the Sumerians, literally right out of the Stone Age, show up and are bequeathing us information that literally over 100 of the firsts needed for a modern culture came from the Sumerians. One of those things was mathematics. They had a base math of 6 and 10. Now, usually people would just round this off to say 60 sexagesimal, but it was actually the number 6 and the number 10 separately so that they could do very large and very small integers. They were the first ones to devise a metric system. They were the first ones to give 12 inches to the foot, 360 degrees to the circle, 12 hours in a day, 12 months in a year, 60 seconds. All of these were derivatives of the number 12 and also the number 6. That number 12, though, is a key point that I'll stress here as you'll see as we go on. So myth or facts, one of the great scholars that we have who's really divulged into this research, now at 83, his name's Zecharia Sitchin, and he's one of the pinnacle researchers as a linguist of about 220 people in the world, 220 in the whole world that can actually directly read Sumerian cuneiform script. So Zecharia Sitchin has really taken on an interesting scholastic approach to information that modern linguists and archaeologists aren't quite ready to accept. Now, linguists today will squabble over the meaning of this word or the meaning of this phrase, but Zecharia Sitchin was one of the very few linguists to look at all of the information being told, all of the context, all of the meaning, and put it into a context that makes sense, that starts to combine science, but also explains where we come from, the religious aspects of this information. So I was really intrigued by the research that he's done. He's written a series of books called the Earth Chronicles. You can see a few of them here. Zecharia Sitchin is now 83 years old, so it's up to myself and many of the other younger generations to continue on and hold these principles to truth. So here's an evidence of cuneiform script. Sometimes they would write on semi-precious stones, but you can see it's a system of, again, little lines and triangles. But very interesting details of what they were describing. Now, they'll teach you in high schools or in the college institutions today that the Sumerians were the first ones to invent writing and the first ones to have mathematics. But they don't ever tell you specifically what they were writing or how extensive their knowledge really was. So one of the other information pieces that I've tried to focus on with the Sumerians is not only did they have a very vast knowledge of mathematics and science, education, they were also very aware of astronomy. And they were the first ones, for instance, to invent the 12 houses of the zodiac by dividing the heavens into 12 parts. They came up with a system so that at the time of heliochal rising, this is basically if you look out right when the sun is rising, the sun just in the in the very early morning is rising against the like the dark of space, and you can see a constellation what the sun is rising against. So if we see Aquarius or Sagittarius or Leo, what constellation the sun is rising against, you're in the age of Aquarius, you're in the age of Pisces. So they were able to devise a very ingenious way and knew about precession, this 25,000-year cycle, to bequeath all this information about astronomy so that now, when we have technology, we can start to look at this information and start to wonder, what were they trying to tell us? Now, along with this information about outer planets, the distance between the outer planets, what the planets look like in space, they very specifically give some information that when modern scholars and archaeologists first started doing excavations in Iraq, early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, they started to pull out all of these artifacts where, in some cases, the Sumerians are talking about beings called the Anunnaki. And that term just means those who from heaven come to earth. But at the time, in the early 1900s, many of these scholars finding these artifacts and the Sumerians speaking of the Anunnaki, interaction with their living gods, talking about the outer planets. Scholars didn't quite understand this information, so they threw it all into a big myth pile and just left it untouched, as these are cultural mythologies coming from a culture that is not rooted in science. We're not going to even venture into the idea that they were actually visited by beings from another planet. Can't go there. So that's where modern scholarly views stop. But, again, people like Zecharia Sitchin, myself, Eric von Daniken, and others will look at this information and say, well, what if they were trying to convey things that they only understood by the terms they had at the time? So if you see a flying object in the sky or a being coming out of a glowing ship to whatever effect, you're going to think of it as a god. Anything at that time flying in the skies was alive, a bird, an animal. So many of the artifacts that they've left us show us information that we have to look through the eyes of the ancient person to see what they were trying to tell us. But from a modern view, again, some of these things we can prove with our technology. And one of those, from the astronomical standpoint, was they had a very vigorous view about astronomy and tracked things that happened in our heavens over hundreds of years. Here's a tablet stored in the British Museum that shows observations of Venus. Here's another one that recorded natural weather events, things that were taking place. And this was, again, something that they would do over generations of time and pass this down as sacred information. Anyone who was able to read this information, it was a privilege. They had scribes and priests, and to be able to write cuneiform script was an honor. And so the information that was held by these priests was something that was very esoteric. One of the tablets, for instance, would be able to predict 50 years in advance on what specific day a lunar eclipse would take place. So they could know 50 years in advance, on this specific day, we're going to have a lunar eclipse. It's very interesting information. Again, another tablet just showing at some point where certain stars were in the sky and tracking their progression. So what really starts to raise the question is was ancient man visited by gods or possibly ancient astronauts? Many of the tales that we have in the biblical form of chariots of fire or Ezekiel's wheel, or Noah having interactions with a god telling him to build a craft. Many of these stories have a Sumerian counterpart where it's literally word for word the same tale, but told in a Sumerian script that's recorded in stone, unchanged. So to put that into perspective, we have the New King James English version of the Bible, but that has been translated from the New Testament to the Old Testament to various other Semitic languages as a compilation of the original tales told by the Sumerians, which we have in stone unchanged. So when we start to look at many of these texts that talk about angels in the Bible and depict the angels in the Bible with a halo and with wings, these aren't the first generation of these depictions. There's actually the Sumerian depictions that, again, predate the Hebrew God and the Christian God by thousands of years. And let me put it into perspective so you understand what I'm saying. We're in the year 2005, which is basically 2,000 years removed from when the time of Christ was here, AD to BC. So if you go back another 2,000 years from that point, you're at the time of the Abraham God. Go back another 2,000 years from that, 6,000 years, 4,000 BC, 6,000 years, and you're at the time of the Sumerians. So it's a good leap back in history. So a lot of the tales that we have in English just specifically talk about heaven. Heaven is up there somewhere, and the gods come from heaven. But this is actually a misnomer, because all of the references of the word heaven in the New King James Version are meant to just be conveying the skies. They're not talking about pearly gates up there with clouds, somewhere mythically. They're talking about the skies. So if we were to actually just replace the word heaven with skies, it really starts to bring in a lot more context for beings coming down from the skies. So many of the depictions that we still have left to us in ancient Iraq, this is actually a stellar that's held in Iran, show a time when the Sumerians had interaction with their living gods, which they called the Anunnaki. And here we see a depiction of an Anunnaki coming down on what the Sumerians depicted him as having the power of flight. So they are depicting him coming down and meeting a Sumerian king, and you can see the Sumerians underneath here holding up the view. Now, interestingly enough, I've kind of like to make a joke that, here's the king meeting the Sumerian god, and these must be the taxpayers making it possible for him to do this. But we have these wall reliefs all over the Middle East that show a connection, just like it spawned into Egyptian cultures, of the winged disc. This winged disc is the reference gave by the Sumerians of the Anunnaki, and that they had the power of flight. Now, again, if you're living in a clay hut and using stone tools, you're not going to know the difference between gods and extraterrestrials. So beings having the power of flight, they don't know how to depict that other than to say wings. Just like they would see in nature, a bird has wings, it has the power of flight. Another view of this stellar. Another thing I'd like to point out too is, a couple of years ago when I invaded Iraq again, one of those interesting points is we still don't know why. Weapons of mass destruction, oil, no. What was it? So there's been a lot of speculation from the ufological point of view that, interestingly enough, Saddam Hussein, Iraq, Sumer, same place, is very aware of his heritage and his connection to the Anunnaki, and has done several things. Now this is just rumor and speculation, but had several things underway where he was actually trying to build like an Anunnaki theme park. And there have been diagrams and things found. I have a couple of connections military-wise of people in Iraq who have sent me some art pieces and things found in a couple of Saddam's palaces that show just very interesting connections where Saddam was aware of this information bequeathed by the Anunnaki. So some of the artifacts here, again, you can see the detail. This is one of the gods that the Sumerians depicted as Ishtar, also known as Inanna, and she was known to roam the skies of Earth. And there's an interesting tale that she was a very attractive female, a female god, and at some times she would choose male counterparts to bring up into her adobe and have sexual relations with them. But unfortunately, those men would always be killed afterwards. And there's a famous king that relays this tale in a Sumerian text. His name is Gilgamesh. And very interestingly, he talks about how Ishtar had her eyes upon him and invited him up and said, thank you, but no thanks, because of what you've been known to do with various other men who have come to visit you. So the interesting thing that I just point out here is that this is a typical wall relief the Sumerians left us of the Anunnaki. Basically, this specifically is an Anunnaki that was in charge of a spaceport. Now, this is information bequeathed to us by Zecharia Sitchin. Again, one of about 220 people in the world that can directly translate Sumerian cuneiform script. And what he's translated, the Sumerians are describing here one of their Anunnaki. And some of the things I'd point out is in his right hand he's holding the fruit of life and the water of life in the other hand. So these are, again, symbologies that we have for the Garden of Eden and the tree of life and the fruit and many of these things. And also I've kind of pointed out several times, you'll see around his wrist what as I would interpret it to be a watch. But back then the Sumerians wouldn't understand what technology is. So several of the wall reliefs that show these Anunnaki with some type of wristband, it looks more like of a floral pattern. Whether or not they were wearing just a wrist, a bracelet of some kind, I think it's very possible, just like with our state of technology, they might have had some type of small wrist device, and they're depicting that as accurately as they could in a stellar. But very interesting.